Hey there, and thanks for joining us for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a really difficult and complex situation, one with tragic human consequences. We're diving into the conflict in Manipur, India. And this deep dive, it's unique, like all of them, because it's based entirely on the material you brought to us.
Hmm.
A stack of articles, research, your own notes, all focused on understanding the history and the dramatic recent escalation of violence there.
Exactly. And our goal today, working strictly from the information you've shared, is really to cut through that complexity. We want to pull out the most important insights, understand the core issues, and try to grasp why this conflict has been so persistent and devastating. It's about navigating a challenging, layered situation using the roadmap you provided.
Okay, let's get into it then. What is this conflict all about at its core, according to your sources? The material describes it fundamentally as ethnic violence, driven by these long-standing tensions in Manipur state up in northeastern India. Your sources identify the main communities caught in the middle as the Meitei and the Kuki-Zo communities.
Right. And while these tensions, they've simmered for a long time, your sources make it very clear that things just exploded. Widespread violence in May 2023. The material really highlights the scale, the severity, the loss of life, massive displacement, significant destruction. It's stark.
Right. So what specific event triggered that explosion in May 2023? There was a particular day, an action that seems to have been the spark.
That's right. According to the material you shared, the immediate trigger was a tribal solidarity march. It was organized on May 3rd, 2023. This march was put together by a group called the All Tribal Students Union of Manipur, or ATSU.
And the reason why this march happened is really central to understanding the conflict, as your sources explain it. It was basically a protest against the Meitei community's long-standing demand. We want to be included in India's scheduled tribes list, the ST list. And this is where that core tension really comes to a head.
Okay, so the Meitei community wants ST status, but the tribal communities, like the Kuki-Zo, are protesting this. Why? Why is that demand such a flashpoint? What's the core fear, based on your sources? Well, the core fear articulated in your sources among the tribal communities, particularly those in the hills, it's directly tied to land. That's the crux of it. Granting ST status to the Meiteis, who mainly live in the valley, would potentially allow them to acquire land in the hill areas. And your sources explain that these tribal communities currently hold exclusive rights over land in the hills. It's a protection, often rooted in historical laws, constitutional provisions.
Right, meant to preserve tribal identity, prevent displacement.
Exactly. So this mighty demand is seen as a direct threat to that fundamental right.
Okay, so it's not just about, status. It's about deeply rooted rights and resources. And your sources mentioned it goes beyond just land, too.
It does. The material you shared also points out that tribal communities fear it would significantly upset the existing, delicate balance of political and economic power within the state, a balance which they feel already favors the valley-based Meiteis.
That really lays out the fundamental tension there. To understand it better, maybe we should look a little closer at the communities themselves, as described in your sources. So on one side, you have the Meitei community. Your sources describe them as the majority group, maybe about 53% of Manipur's population. They primarily live in the Imphal Valley, which is quite fertile, mostly Hindu, and they're seeking this ST status for, constitutional benefits quotas in government jobs, education, that sort of thing. The sources also note their existing economic and political dominance within the state.
Then there are the Kuki-Zo tribes. It's actually a collection of related groups. The material you provided highlights that they are predominantly Christian and they inhabit the hill districts that surround the valley. Their perspective, as it's presented in your sources, is one of feeling marginalized and fearing further dominance by the Meitei majority.
Right. There's a specific grievance from the Kuki-Zo community mentioned in your material, right? Something that adds to this feeling of marginalization.
Yes, there is. Your sources specifically mention that Kuki-Zo groups have accused the state government of targeting them through eviction drives in the hill areas, often citing concerns like encroachment on reserved forest land. So this accusation adds another significant layer to their feeling of being, pushed out or unfairly treated.
Okay, moving from the causes to the effect, your sources detail the really heartbreaking reality on the ground when the violence erupted after that march. What happened? The material describes ethnic clashes just breaking out and spreading incredibly rapidly across Manipur. It says it started specifically in the Churachandpur district, which is a significant Kuki-Zo area. And the statistics shared in your sources are Well, they're devastating. Reports indicate over 200 people have died as a direct result of the violence, and thousands upon thousands displaced, forced to flee their homes, many seeking refuge in makeshift relief camps within Manipur or even escaping to neighboring states.
The scale of destruction described in your sources is also immense. We're talking churches, temples, homes, entire villages, even government buildings burned. It paints a really grim picture of the breakdown of civil order.
Your sources also noted the immediate response from the state government to the escalating violence. What did they actually do? One of the first significant steps mentioned was shutting down the internet across the entire state.
Yes, according to the material, this was done with the stated aim of trying to control rumors and misinformation, things that were potentially fueling the violence. And alongside that, a massive deployment of security forces occurred. Your sources mentioned the Indian Army, paramilitary units, all trying to restore some semblance of order.
Right. Now, stepping back from that immediate spark and the resulting violence, your sources delve into the deeper historical currents, the complex issues that have fed this conflict for so long. This is where we get into the underlying causes.
What's striking here, as the material you shared makes clear, is just how fundamental the ethnic and geographical division is. This long-standing separation between the valley-based Meitei community and the hill-based tribal communities, it's deep-rooted.
And central to that division, as we discussed, is that critical issue of land ownership and those specific protection laws, where tribal communities have exclusive land rights in the hills. This remains a perpetual point of tension.
Your sources also highlight a significant political dimension. This persistent feeling of political marginalization experienced by the hill tribes. They feel their interests are often secondary to those of the dominant valley community.
Beyond those core ethnic and political lines, your sources introduce other contributing factors that analysts believe play a role. These include issues related to illegal immigration, particularly along that porous border with Myanmar, and also concerns around the illicit drug trade, which is reportedly prevalent in some of those border regions.
And this brings us to a particularly sensitive point mentioned in your sources. There have been accusations made against elements within the state police and administration, alleging bias, basically. Bias in their actions or perhaps inaction during the conflict. Your sources present these as accusations that have been raised by affected communities and observers.
Absolutely, just reporting what the material contains. So bringing ourselves up to the present situation, say as of mid-2025, how do your sources describe the state of affairs in Manipur? Is it resolved?
No, the sources state very clearly that despite the deployment of security forces and maybe some de-escalation from the peak, the conflict has not been fully resolved, not by a long shot.
The state remains highly polarized along ethnic lines. Your sources note that while there are efforts toward reconciliation, they face immense challenges, given the level of violence and just the deep mistrust now.
And a significant development your material highlights is the emergence of distinct political demands from Kuki-Zo groups, specifically calls for a separate administrative unit, or even in some cases, a separate state altogether.
Your sources also point out that the situation has drawn external attention. Civil society groups within India, international human rights organizations. They've raised serious concerns. Some sources specifically mention fears of ethnic cleansing and questions about the government's response, its effectiveness in protecting all communities. Again, this is according to the reporting of the sources you provided.
And finally, your sources mention that the Supreme Court of India has taken judicial notice of aspects of the situation. It's reportedly monitoring certain related legal and humanitarian matters.
So, given this incredibly complex backdrop, what do your sources identify as necessary steps? Steps for moving forward, for finding a path towards stability, maybe even peace.
The material you provided lists several critical needs. First and foremost, it calls for honest, genuine political dialogue between the leaders, the representatives of all the affected communities.
It also emphasizes the necessity of establishing a neutral and fair administration, one that's perceived as impartial by both valley and hill communities. That seems crucial.
Absolutely. And restoring trust between the ethnic groups is highlighted as essential, though it's acknowledged as an extremely difficult task after such violence.
Your sources also suggest that focusing developmental efforts fairly on both the hills and the valleys is crucial to address those historical economic disparities.
And finally, the material stresses the need for justice, accountability for those responsible for the violence, along with comprehensive rehabilitation for the thousands of affected families, individuals who've lost everything.
Well, that was a deep dive into a truly challenging and, frankly, painful situation. We've explored the many layers of the Manipur conflict based on the material you shared, From that immediate trigger, the horrific violence that followed, to the deep-seated historical, ethnic, and political issues, the underlying economic and social factors, and, where things stand right now.
Understanding complex conflicts like this, especially those rooted in historical grievances and identity politics, it really requires looking at how all these intertwined factors create a kind of perfect storm, just as the sources you provided allowed us to see. And as we wrap up, here's something to maybe ponder, drawing directly from the tensions and the stated needs highlighted in your source material. Given those strong calls we discussed for a separate administration by one major group, and at the same time the clearly acknowledged need for restoring trust, achieving honest dialogue, ensuring justice for all communities involved, how immense is that challenge? The challenge of reconciling such fundamentally competing visions for the future of a single state. What does it truly take, to bridge these kinds of deep ethnic, geographical, and historical divides?
That's a powerful question to sit with. Thank you again for providing the sources that allowed us to take this deep dive today. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep thinking critically about these incredibly important and challenging issues.